So, with me today, I have Michael Ventrella. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Nice to see you, Mark.
Okay. Okay, so we'll probably talk about a bunch of different things, but I wanted to talk today about how to argue the Constitution with a conservative.
Yes, that's one of my latest books. It's my one of my nonfiction books, along with the Monkees books that obviously we wrote together.
Yes.
But this one is a little more serious in some ways, but still very humorous and funny. I wanted to look at the Constitution as the eye of a lawyer, a former constitutional law professor, politician, someone with a political science background, who specializes in the Constitution, who's worked with the ACLU. I have some experience. I'm not just some guy writing a book. Let's put it
I
that
mean, which is
way.
one reason I was curious about it, because people, you know, uh, on Facebook, of course, people always say, well, who gives you whatever? And sometimes you even correct me on certain things. So, I do not profess to be an expert on any of this, but we've all are guilty of being experts in the last few years.
Especially with politics, and actually I should say with science, because everyone thinks they know better than the experts at science
Right.
quite often online too, and I feel very frustrated about that.
Right.
But especially with the Constitution, everyone thinks they know better. It's like, people will go to a doctor and the doctor will say, well, based on my years of experience, I'm going to say that you have this. And so, oh, thank you, doctor. But if I say, based on my years of experience, this is what the Constitution say, everyone goes, no, it doesn't. I go, look, maybe I might know what I'm talking about, okay? People read into it what they want to read into it. In some
Right.
ways, the Constitution is like the Bible,
Hmm.
because some people will read the Bible and they think that their interpretation is the only one that possibly could be made, and anyone else who thinks it differently is completely wrong and an idiot. And some people look at the Constitution that way too, and they're wrong. It's subject to interpretation.
Right. So one of my questions was, what is the most frequent misconception? I mean, that might be a lengthy answer, but overall with the Constitution.
Well, I'd sort of tie it to that. The Constitution was written by politicians. There are a whole bunch of compromises in the Constitution that were made, like the 3/5 Compromise and the Virginia Compromise, and I talk about those in the book. And to think that it was done by gods and carved in stone is the biggest misconception that I always have to beat people over the head. Well, the founding fathers wouldn't want this. I don't care what a bunch of slave-owning white rich men thought 250 years ago. What's going to apply now?
Right.
It's that kind of mindset we have to break more than anything else.
Right.
We want to live up to the ideals of the Constitution without necessarily being tied to the stupid parts of it.
Right. What do you think about people who argue with you, with one or anyone, not just you, but about, well, these are, and I'll use the typical example. This is my Second Amendment rights. It can never be changed. Yet the word amendment is a change already. So,
Yes. And the problem is people will read into it exactly what they want to read into it. And they'll say, well, the Second Amendment says you can't restrict my guns at all. And I'll say, no, the Supreme Court has said you certainly can. There are reasonable restrictions that can be done. And then they go, no, it doesn't say that. And I go, look, the Constitution says whatever the judges say it says. For instance, up till a few years ago, look, my opinion has always been that the Constitution protects gay and lesbian people because they are people under the 14th Amendment.
mhm,
But until this summer, when the Supreme Court came out with that decision, that wasn't true. So my opinion might have said one thing, but what is true is whatever the judges say it's true. So
right.
that's one of the arguments I have to make with people all the time. They'll read into it and say, well, it says this. And yeah, but judges disagree with you, and they're the ones who decide what the Constitution means. I'm sorry, the law says this, even if I disagree with it.
So I don't know how to phrase this. I mean, because it kind of demeans the value of a judge in a certain way. Basically, a judge can just change his tune on a regular basis, really, correct?
Well, yes, but that's why we have a Supreme Court to make those kind of decisions. The Supreme Court has obviously reversed itself many times. They'll make a decision and then a
Okay.
new court will come in with new members and they'll decide something differently. So yeah, the meaning of the Constitution can change over time too. And obviously it should. What was considered cruel and unusual punishment in 1786 is not what we consider cruel and unusual punishment today. Words change, meanings change. And to say we have to base our opinions on what the founding fathers thought. Well, what did the founding fathers think of internet regulations?
Hmm.
There are things that the founding fathers had no idea about. If you had told the founding fathers that we'd have a black president, their heads would have exploded. The idea of having women in the room as senators, they wouldn't have believed that either. We can't limit ourselves Amish-like to a time that doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
And
Now,
that's one of the biggest arguments I usually have with people about the Constitution, is
now,
they,
no, one that I always, and I know the answer, but I'll have you talk about it. The one I always see is, oh, well, and this is, of course, before Biden made a choice. Now he's chosen Kamala Harris as the
Mhm.
vice president for the Democrat side. But they said, well, why doesn't he pick Barack Obama to be his vice president? Because Barack Obama could be president again because there's been a 4-year gap,
No.
and it's like, no, no. So what, for those people who don't know, what are the rules for the president? The maximum he can serve and how he can serve.
Well, in order to be president, you have some restrictions. You have to be a natural born citizen. You have to be 35 years of age. You have to have lived in the United States for a certain amount of time, things like that.
Mhm.
And because of a later amendment put in after FDR, there's now a restriction for 2 terms or 10 years. And the reason they said or 10 years is so that, say a president dies in office and someone takes over for the last 2 years, they can still run more than once.
Right.
Which could have happened with Johnson when Kennedy died. Johnson could have run again.
Right. They
But he
chose not
decided
to in
not
the
to.
60s.
Right.
Yeah. Hmm.
So basically, a president is limited to that much time. So there's no way Obama is eligible to be vice president because he's ineligible to be president. The vice president has to be able to take over if the president suddenly dies.
Even
And
if, and I know the answer, but even if, let's say, he was the vice president for Biden, and Biden died day one, and then Obama went in there, and he could serve 2 years, and just, can't, to make
I
that
don't think
maximum of 10.
no, because when you're running for office, that's sort of the same argument as if someone had been president for 9 years and decided to run for re-election for a 4-year term.
Okay.
The courts would say, no, you're not eligible for presidents because it's a 4-year term.
Right.
So I don't think that would apply at all.
Yeah.
No,
I
you
mean,
can't.
I do know all this, but I figured I will give you,
No, this is
but
another
that's
argument
what
people make all the
that's
time.
what I argue with people on Facebook all the time, and they'll say little situations like that.
Well,
Now, what
people,
about the situation where, let's say, Donald Trump decides to postpone the election, which is not very possible, but you can talk about that too, and Pelosi could possibly be president. How does that work?
that is a possibility. What would happen is oh, well, first of all, he doesn't get a chance to postpone the election. The elections are run by the states, and there's no way the states are going to go along with it, especially not the blue states.
Yeah.
So he can't just stop it. He can't stop the election. It's going to happen. We had an election during the Civil War. We had an election every time there was an election. We can do it this time. There's nothing unusual. But if somehow, let's say that they're trying to count the votes and he's challenging it in court, and something is coming up, and it's January 20th, and it's time for the president to take office, he doesn't get to stay. No, his term ends on January 20th. And if we don't know who the new president is, then yes, the Speaker of the House becomes president.
Okay,
Who knows
so it
how
would
long
be
that
the
lasts.
Speaker of the House, because also, and I think I misspoke on Facebook, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. So Pelosi's term actually ends January 3rd, correct? So it would be the Speaker of the House. It wouldn't necessarily be her. It'd be
Correct.
the
Yeah. If
next
they elect
Speaker
a
of the
different
House.
if
Yeah,
they elect
okay,
a different Speaker of the House, it would be whoever the Speaker of the House is.
okay,
But I don't
okay.
expect that to change.
Yeah. And when I said my comment, hey, say hello to President Pelosi, I wasn't thinking about that the term ended on a different date, but yeah, it does.
Yeah.
So I stand corrected on that one. Okay. Here's one for you. So since you are a criminal defense lawyer
Yes.
and you are always working with different cases that could arguably, to whom you're talking about, mirror something that Donald Trump is or isn't doing, does this have any effect on your job? Meaning, he seems to be getting away with certain things. And does that make
Not my
your
day-to-day
job
job.
harder because that decision has been made about him? Does it trickle down to your cases at all?
Not really. In my cases are pretty basic, local cases, people getting DUIs, and getting into fights and normal, it's, even though I have some big cases, what happens in the White House hasn't changed much. What is more important in Pennsylvania, since I'm dealing with Pennsylvania law, not federal law, is who our attorney general is and who our governor is and who our state legislature is more than anything else. I actually have an appeal now with the Pennsylvania Superior Court challenging the constitutionality of our laws on DUI laws regarding marijuana. And I've got the ACLU has joined me. And basically we're saying the way the current law says is if you have any amount of marijuana in your system, then you're guilty of driving under the influence, even if you smoked it 10 days earlier, because it's still in your system, right? And at the time that law was written, marijuana was completely illegal everywhere. Now it's not. We have medical marijuana in Pennsylvania. And so I'm saying the law is unconstitutional because it's punishing people who aren't guilty. They're not driving under the influence, you know, and, you know, he could have smoked it in a different state where it was legal. So you're punishing somebody for something that's legal. So we'll see what happens with that appeal. That ought to be fun.
Yeah. Although
so I do every once in a while get constitutional issues, but not that often.
Yeah. Although, you know, this is my fiance and I, we don't tell anybody during this pandemic. We travel around occasionally, but you know, we're very safe and everything. So
well, it's legal where you are, so you know you can get away with it.
Yeah,
I'm in Pennsylvania. It's only
we still have to
here.
wear. Yeah, but I mean, here's an interesting thing. So we went to Crater Lake. Crater Lake is federal land, so it has a big sign saying you can't smoke it here. We don't care what Oregon says. So,
that is true.
You have issues like that. I mean, where it's legal in some, say, some county or some national park or something. Not just marijuana, just any sort of.
Yeah. One of the problems we have in America is we have hundreds and hundreds of different legal units. You know, every state has its own different laws and every county has its own different regulations, you know, and then a city might have a different rule. In Philadelphia, for instance, they passed a law that says that if you're caught with marijuana, it's just a ticket. You don't get a misdemeanor like you will every place else, you know. So in a sense, little communities can actually change their laws too. So yeah, you need to know what the law is in your local area.
So, okay.
There's not much I can do about that, you know.
Let's see. What is another one that people ask about?
Well, the Electoral College is one. I have a whole chapter.
There you
on
go. That's a good
College.
one. The Electoral College, because
I'm always arguing with people about that, and quite often the argument comes down to, but that's what the founders want, which goes back to my main point about who cares what the founders want, you know. It is a completely undemocratic system that we need to get rid of, and I said that long before George W. Bush got elected. You know, this is a pet peeve of mine. The problem is it requires a constitutional amendment. That's very hard to pass. Yeah. So what I and some others people have been doing, and I argue this in the book, is to adopt what's called the Wyoming Plan. Do you know that? The idea here is that every state, every district, Wyoming is the smallest state. Right. And they have one representative for the entire state with their 500,000 people they have, which is, you know, smaller than Washington, D.C. You know, Washington, D.C. has more people than Wyoming. So what happens is the concept of the Wyoming Plan is that should be the basis for all districts. Every district should be around that same size, because right now you've got districts in California. California has much less representation than they should. Yeah. For instance, because they have the largest population, and a voter in Wyoming has like 5 times as much power as a voter in California. Right. So the Wyoming Plan would say that every district would have to be this size, which means we would have to add more representatives. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says we can't. Right now it's at 435 members, where it's been since like 1929. So we can certainly add more members to the Constitution, that members to the House of Representatives, since the country has gotten bigger. California would get a whole bunch of new more representatives. Texas would, Florida would, New York would, Pennsylvania would. And that would much better represent the people than the current Electoral College. Yeah. So that's one thing that can be done if the Democrats get into power in January. That might be something they can pass without needing a constitutional amendment. That would help. That would be a good temporary fix.
How did that work? I mean, I remember like in the 70s, it seemed like New York had more electoral votes than it does now, by far. Like it was up in the 40s, and now it's like 23 or something. And whereas California was like about 40, and then now it's like 55. So it's like, I thought New York was still more populous, but also aren't they about even at worst? And so that's like is a weird
California
skew.
Keeps growing. People are moving south and into warmer climates away from the north, you know, and that's just the way it is. But the problem is we have limited our House of Representatives to 435, which means that every 10 years we divide the country up into 435 districts. And we try to make them as even as possible. And the problem we can't make it as even as possible is because some places are so small, like Wyoming, that screw everything up. So we try to make them as even as possible, which means some states lose some and some states gain some. Under the Wyoming Plan, we can just say they all have to be at least you know, 500,000 people in a district.
Hmm.
And if they get more, they get more. And if they lose, they lose. So it's because we've limited ourselves on how many representatives we have, which we shouldn't do.
So that wouldn't take any sort of constitutional amendment.
Correct. That's just a bill. They can just pass the bill and say from
Huh,
now on, the
interesting.
House of Representatives is 550 people, you know, and we divide the country up that way.
Yeah. What about the recent? Well, it's recent now, but I've heard it many times of making Washington D.C. a state, or at least represented with representation.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's going to require an amendment too, because Washington D.C.
yeah.
is mentioned in the Constitution, unfortunately, and that's going to be harder to pass. And the Republicans have been very blatant and honest about it, because they say, but if you do that, we'll get 2 black senators. You know, so I mean, they're letting their racism show very clearly on that one. And Trump has actually said that. So don't expect it to happen as long as the Republicans are in power. And the other problem is that they still have to get 3/4 of the state to agree for any constitutional amendment. And a lot of these states are not going to allow Washington, D.C. to have that happen.
Yeah.
The only way it's going to come about is some sort of compromise they can come up with, and I'm not sure what that would be.
Yeah. What about all the other territories that we have? You know, Guam and Puerto Rico and everything like that. That would be the same situation.
No, they don't need amendments. No, we can add
Okay.
Puerto Rico tomorrow. We can add Guam tomorrow if Congress passes the bill and
Okay.
says, you know, they're going to be a state. Puerto Rico should be a state. They're larger than, like, you know, 20 other states, you know, so they should be.
Okay, so refresh my memory then on District of Columbia. Where does it say it in the Constitution about that then? That it
Well,
has to be an amendment and go that way.
yeah, well, there was actually an amendment passed to give them the right to vote for president. You know, that because before they couldn't even vote for president. The idea of the Constitution was Washington D.C. was a compromise. If you saw Hamilton, you saw that you know, in the room where it happens, where they made that decision to put Washington D.C. there, and the idea was it was going to be neutral, separate from every state, because back then states had a lot more power.
Yep.
And so by making it a separate district that was not answerable to any state, they thought it would give it neutrality, and it wouldn't have it. They didn't know people were going to live in it. They didn't know it was going to be that powerful and that populous. You know, it's a big city.
Yeah.
To me, the simplest solution is you make it part of Maryland. You know, and then it's not another state, but Maryland gets a whole bunch more members of the, you know, and maybe they'll get another representative or 2.
Okay. I never really thought about it, and even when I visited there, I go, wow, all these people actually live here, you know.
Yeah, well, you notice their license plates. Did you see what their license plates say? The license plates actually say on them, taxation without representation.
Wow. Okay. I don't know if they did back in 1984. That's when I went to Washington.
Well, they might not have.
Yeah. Wow, that's funny. I'll have to look that up.
I should also mention for the book, just in case, for anyone who's watching this, you might see the background. That's the cover. It's by Darren Bell, who is a famous political cartoonist. He also does a lot of cartoons in the book. He, right before the book was being ready to be published, he won the Pulitzer Prize for editorial cartooning. So we made sure we put that on the cover in big letters. It was like, great timing, thank you. So the book is meant to be fun and funny and make learning about the Constitution interesting. There are lots of jokes in it. I make lots of snide comments, and his cartoons help as well. So I just wanted to point that out.
Now, does your book go through all the amendments, all 27 of them and everything, or is it
basically what I do is
the biggies that everybody talks about?
I have a chapter where I talk about each amendment, just so you know what they are, so you have a reference. And of course, in the back is the actual Constitution in the appendix. But the amendments that I really talk about, I have sections on freedom of speech. I have sections on freedom of religion. I'm looking at the book now, freedom of association. There's a chapter called "The Second Amendment Sucks and Doesn't Belong Here," and I argue why we should get rid of the Second Amendment completely. A chapter about, you know, searching and seizuring, which is, you know, the Fifth Amendment, Fourth and Fifth Amendment. Chapter about the Fifth Amendment remaining silent. Other constitutional rights, equal protection and discrimination, things like that. So I take the important amendments. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, you know, the Prohibition Amendment. You know,
right.
Some of them you just sort of mention, and that's all you have to talk about.
Right, especially since it was reversed. But
well, the whole idea of the book is what are the issues people normally talk about with the Constitution. So I don't go into a lot of detail about Article 6. You know, I talk about the things that are issues that people talk about and argue. So that's why that keeps the book more interesting too.
Right. I assume you talk a lot about the 25th one, because they always say, well, let's invoke the 25th and get rid of Trump. But it's like, it seems to me it's very vague. Is that correct?
The 25th was written after Kennedy was shot, because the worry was, what if he was in a coma? What do we do if a president is incapacitated?
Mhm.
And the 25th says that the cabinet and the vice president go to Congress and say, listen, we think the president is incompetent, and therefore we want to make the vice president the president. So it has to come from the cabinet, which is never going to happen under Trump, right? He's filled his cabinet with all his toadies. So it's really, the 25th really only applies if someone is really literally completely incompetent, and brain dead, so it really won't apply to Trump, because they're not going to do it, that.
And he's already brain dead. Oops. Anyway.
Yes, but he's got to get his cabinet to agree to that, and that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So.
And how does that work? I mean, I kind of know the presidential succession, but I mean, well, let me ask this, because certain things kind of confused me as a kid, and I've never bothered to look it up. So in 1973, Spiro Agnew was guilty of tax evasion or tax whatever he did, and so he resigned. And instead of having like a special election at the time, Nixon just said, "You, Gerald Ford, come here. You're my vice president now."
Well,
how was he able
to?
Say that again?
You had to be approved by the Senate. The Senate approved Ford. And then, of course, Nixon resigned, and then Ford became president, and then he nominated Nelson Rockefeller, and they went through the Senate process again.
Okay, so it has to go through the Senate on that. Okay, so which amendment covers that, or which article covers that?
Boy, you got me on the spot. I don't have that memorized. But it is in there for like there was some issues involved with that in terms of who do they pick, and I think it's in Article 3.
Okay.
But I can't remember which section. Article 3 is about the presidency, so it's not in an amendment. It's in the actual articles itself.
Okay. Because it always seemed weird to me, not as a kid, but now when looking back on it, it's like, wow, Ford never got elected to anything. He just got up there, and it's like, it's kind of a creepy way if there was a guy like Trump. Hey, let's pick him. Yeah, we like him. If and he just kind of rose to the ranks, kind of.
Well, Ford was the minority leader at the time. So, he was like the Republican version of the Speaker of the House. So he was like the most prominent Republican in the House at the time.
Yeah.
So he wasn't like nobody. But still, it's, that was a very unusual circumstance where we had a president who had never technically been elected. And then he ran for re-election and lost. So he was our only president who was never elected.
Mm-hmm. And another one is, this is around that same time, actually before that, it's like they had comedy albums and stuff where they were talking about, Nixon, you're going to dump me in 72. Can a president really dump their vice president at any time? Is that possible?
No, but they can choose not to have them with their next running. So Trump could theoretically turn around and say, I've decided not to have Pence as my vice president next time.
Okay, so that still is applicable, because I know in the old days, like FDR, he had like 3 vice presidents over the course of his 4 terms. So,
so you can always pick, a different vice president, and Lincoln, of course, had a vice president from the opposite party because he wanted to bring the country together, which was a terrible mistake.
Oops.
Because once he died, the president was, all that stuff Lincoln wanted to do, forget it.
Yes.
That didn't help.
And of course, he was the first president impeached. So it's like,
yes.
Now, as far as impeachment goes, of course, Trump has been impeached. And for those who don't know, Nixon wasn't, because he resigned before that could happen. But Bill Clinton was, and Andrew Johnson was. But in each case, they never actually kicked the person out. I mean, is it always because, like in this last case, I don't even remember on the Clinton one because I wasn't paying such close attention, but is it always the case where like the Senate is just like hard-nosed, we can't kick this guy out, or what's the situation?
I think in both Clinton and Johnson's impeachment, it was clearly political. They really hadn't done any. You're supposed to be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors.
Right.
And in both of those cases, there really was no high crime or misdemeanor. People will say, oh, but Clinton committed perjury. Well, no, he didn't. He lied under oath about an affair that was not a crime. Perjury means you have to lie about a crime, if I ask you what your favorite color is and you say it's yellow and it's really blue and you've lied under oath, that's not perjury because it doesn't matter what your favorite color is.
Right.
So I think even with Clinton, there were enough people in the Senate who said, no, this is clearly political. We're not going to impeach this guy. In Trump's case, there definitely were impeachable offenses. I mean, you know, we got the whole Mueller report that everyone pretended like, oh, there's nothing there, but there was a ton of things in the Mueller report.
Yeah.
And the Republicans just blew it away, you know,
Yeah.
and they ignored it.
Mm-hmm.
He should have been impeached. Clearly,
Right.
he should have been impeached. We might not be in this mess right now if he had been impeached.
Right.
So that's a little bit different. That one, to me, the of all the impeachments, Nixon's, he would have been impeached, and he should have been if he had stayed in office. And Trump should have been, but the other two were political, I think.
Because Nixon, looking back on it, I wonder if he could have beaten the odds and just been stubborn, just like Trump is, and just said, "Well, impeach me, see what I care." And it could have dragged out till 77 when he would have ended anyway. You know.
Well, basically, what happened was one of the reasons he resigned is because the Republicans in the Senate went to him and said, "Look, we have to vote to impeach you. You better resign because you're going to get impeached." They basically laid down the law to him and said, you know, we've listened to the tapes. It's clear you're guilty. We're going to have to vote to impeach you. You know, back then we had Republicans who actually cared about that kind of stuff and had ethics. So that made a little difference, I think.
Now, if we really actually had, you know, everything working properly, and let's just get off Trump so people who love Trump won't be upset.
People who love Trump will not like my book, so it doesn't matter.
Some future president turns out to be even worse. And let's say, for the benefit of the crowd that hates everything, you know, let's say it's a Democrat.
Okay.
Okay. And, you know, they really do impeach the person. I mean, the person is a real creep. I mean, how does that work at that point? Because it really doesn't describe in the Constitution what would happen at that point. I mean, arguably, the person would just go, "Oh yeah, you're right. I screwed up. I'm gone." You know, but I mean,
well,
is there any rules about that? I mean, it's like, you know, it's almost like even if the Senate did say get out, we could say, "Yeah, well, make me." You know, it's like kind of like that.
I have a feeling that, you know, the Army, he might be the commander-in-chief, but if they say you're no longer the commander-in-chief, who are they going to listen to?
Right.
You know, and if the new president says get out of the White House and the guy doesn't, then he calls the Army and says get this guy out of the White House, and they're going to listen to the new president. One thing that the Army does is they take an oath to obey the Constitution, not the president. You know, and I think that's important to emphasize that, you know, in fact, everyone in political office, Trump doesn't realize this, but everybody in political office takes an oath to the Constitution. You know, and he's constantly saying, you know, you're not loyal to me. Well, we're not supposed to be loyal to you. We're supposed to be loyal to the laws of the country and the country, you know, and that's what real patriotism is. And I expect that if that ever happened and a president refused to leave, that, you know, the Army would do the right thing. You know, the police would do the right thing at that point. Most police.
Now, you know, as far as legality of everything, I know every president since Washington has done executive orders, it seems like. But it seems like in the last 20, 30 years, they've multiplied. And, you know, of course, Trump just, you know, writes them out daily, you know, like a little notepad. It's like, here's this one, here's this one. I mean, do those really stand up in a real court of law? All those, you know, things he's doing. I mean, he's acting like, you know, I'm going to end coronavirus with a stroke of the pen. I'm going to put my face on the Mount Rushmore with a stroke of a pen. I'm going to put a wall around the whole country with a stroke of a pen, you know, and it's like he's pretending to be like this, you know, big leader that does all this stuff, but it's like, isn't it just all bullshit?
Yes, because originally the idea behind the executive orders are usually things having to do with what the executive can control.
Yeah.
For example, as the president, he is responsible for the entire bureaucracy of the government. You know, all the different IRSs and all the different agencies and the CIA, they're under his control. He's their boss. So usually what an executive order would say was, you know, I'm hereby telling all the Justice Department not to prosecute these kind of cases, or whatever he might want to say, you know. And through history, that's what the executive orders were like. Lincoln's order to Emancipation Proclamation is basically an executive order. You know, I'm hereby ordering this. That any territory in our area can, you know, can't have slaves. So it's been around for a long time. Has it gotten worse? Only under Trump. Under Obama, it actually went down. Now, you wouldn't know that from the Republicans because they came out and they said,
Right.
oh my God, Obama's doing everything with executive orders. And now they're completely silent whenever Trump does it.
Yeah.
Trump recently announced an executive order having to do with budgeting, and I'm going to cut the payroll tax. He can't do that. Congress controls the budget. President can't just cut the taxes. He has no power to do that. These executive orders he's signing are publicity things only. 90% of them don't have any effect whatsoever, and some of them are just absolutely wrong. He said just last week, I'm signing an executive order that prohibits insurance companies from from kicking you off from pre-existing conditions. Well, that's already in the law. It's part of Obamacare. You've signed nothing. You haven't changed a thing. He's doing it because partially because he's stupid, but also because he's just trying to get publicity and saying anything he can because he thinks it might help him get reelected.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So what happens with all those things? Because I mean, he's used all these nice little folders, and he has like some sort of pre-typed document, which seems like a monumental waste of time to whomever's creating these things, so he can do his little jig-jaggedy signature on. I mean, it's like
some of them have an effect, and partially what he's mostly having an effect on is not necessarily the executive orders, but who he appoints. Like, the guy who he appointed to be in charge of the post office, who is invested in all the post offices, the companies that are going against the post office, that are competing against the post office. So he's doing everything to destroy the post office.
Yeah.
That has more effect than any executive order, and he does have the right to appoint these people. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Now, technically, most of these people are supposed to be approved by the Senate, but when you have a Senate that's going to do anything he wants and they're going to roll over, that's what happens. And that's why it's important that we should have a strong party to stand up to a president, and not people who just do whatever he wants.
Right.
Make him a king.
Right. One other thing.
I have a whole chapter about parties too, because one of the problems. Here's another argument I get all the time. If you don't mind me just interrupting.
Okay, that's fine.
Mentioning parties, which is that I hate this argument I get every now and then that, the Democratic Party was the party of slavery, and the Democratic Party stood against integrating the schools. And they don't understand history, which is how the parties have split over the years. The Republican Party was originally the Liberal Party with Lincoln and then Teddy Roosevelt, fighting for equality and justice and and those sorts of things. And then over the years it kind of split, and there was a period where there were liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, admittedly, but both parties had liberals and conservatives in them. And it's only been in the recent history that it's really split so that it's all liberals on one party and all conservatives on the other party, because it wasn't like that for most of our recent history. If you go back to the 60s, you can see there are lots of Democrats fighting against the civil rights law. What you can say for truth is that the liberals were the ones favoring the civil law and the conservatives were against it. So when you talk about that kind of issue, don't talk about parties, talk about liberals and conservatives, because liberals in the Republican Party supported it. Conservative Democrats did not. I hate that argument because it just shows that people don't know their history.
Yeah.
It's just stupid.
And I mean, essentially the parties kind of flip-flopped, if you wanted to do it in basic terms, which is kind of surprising how they did it. But I mean, I guess it's just when LBJ Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, it's like all the racists said, well, we can't follow the Democrats anymore. Well, who's left? And then Nixon said, come to me.
Yes, that's when it started, and it wasn't really until like the 80s that it really started getting completely divided, because there were still liberal Republicans in the North. I lived in Boston for a while, and I voted for a few, because that was okay. The party, and the sad part is when you have liberals and conservatives in both parties, it's easier to get things done because you have to compromise to get things done. Right now, we have all the liberals in one party and all the conservatives in one party, and they're all shaking their head and refusing to work with each other, and nothing gets done. So that's not necessarily.
Now, here's another one that I'm actually asking all the time because it doesn't make any sense to me. So, and you can refresh my memory as far as which amendments there are. So, slaves were freed, and we had the Emancipation Proclamation, which I don't know. It's like 15th Amendment. Is that the right one?
13th is the one where the slaves were freed. Okay. The Emancipation Proclamation came before that, of course.
Oh, okay. And then there's all these Voting Rights Acts. And then you go like 50 years forward, and suddenly you got all these Jim Crow laws and this and that and the other. And then you go 50 years further, and they're signing the Civil Rights Act. and then another voting act, and then now we're 50 years from that, and it's like, it's almost like, is it a situation where we just need to enforce what's already on the books, or are there problems with all these civil rights and emancipation proclamations and freeing the slaves? Because it seems like, to make it very generic, the black man is never going to get free enough to vote, basically.
It's judges. It really is, because what happened was, after the Civil War, there were a bunch of conservative judges who put into place things like, separate but equal, which is the policy that said you can have separate schools as long as they're equal. And of course, they never were, and made segregation legal. And, no matter how much you could fight against it and pass laws, if the judges came down and said, nope, that law is unconstitutional, you were stuck.
Mm-hmm.
So the Civil Rights Act in the 60s, we had a very liberal Supreme Court in the 60s, and they passed a lot of good bills and a lot of good, cases.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them, the Civil Rights Acts were passed and held up. Then, I don't know how many, about 10 years ago or so, we got a different Supreme Court, a very conservative Supreme Court. Congress passes unanimously the renewal of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. I'm sorry, the Voting Rights Act.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And the Supreme Court says, nope, you can't do that. What was the reason? There really wasn't one. It was just political. It was all racist. It was just terrible. And so the Supreme Court knocked down the Voting Rights Act. And that's one of the reasons we're in this situation we are now, where there's so much voting fraud going on that we can see. Without the Voting Rights Act, we have no way of enforcing that. So you might have heard Vice President Biden spoke today, and he said that's one of the things that's going to be on the agenda if they get elected in January, is getting the Voting Rights Act reenacted again.
I mean, are we just getting to the
you're
point
stuck
on...
with bad, if you got bad judges, there's not much you can do, which is another reason why you need, of course, I'm talking political now, but, keep that in mind when you vote in November, people, because, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is going to be leaving soon, and we need to have a good replacement for her.
I mean, is this what we have to look forward to, this continual ping pong? Because, I mean, we basically had for 30 years, 8 years Republican, 8 years Democrat, 8 years Republican, 8 years, with a couple of 4-year in there. But, in general, it just goes back and forth. And
well, here's the problem. Here's the problem. Well, there's a lot of different problems. If you look at presidential elections since Bill Clinton, the Democrats have won each one by the popular vote, except one, which is George Bush being reelected, and that was very, very, very slim margin. So the American people want the Democrats in power. The Republicans are winning because of the Electoral College, because of gerrymandering, because of all the tricks they pull to try to keep people from voting, fighting against mail-in ballots, closing precincts. I mean, it's all over the news, they change, they make it harder to vote. They make it so that you have to have certain IDs in order to vote. They're doing everything they can to make it hard to vote because they know if everyone votes, they lose.
Yeah.
So until we can correct that, we're going to have a government that doesn't represent the people. And this is an important issue that I say in the end of the book. I talk about this. People sometimes, the government has moved so far to the right that moderates look like crazy leftists.
Yeah.
I support Medicare for all. I support legalized marijuana. I support women's right to choose. I support equal rights. I support gay rights. All of these things, free public education for colleges if you're poor, taxing richer people. All these things, if you look at the polls, are supported by the majority of the Americans. These aren't radical ideas, but the right and Fox News has managed to convince a lot of Americans that anyone who stands for those things are crazy leftist, crazy people, when actually the rest of the world has done this for years and have no problem with it.
Yeah.
And that's part of the problem. We got to grab the flag and say we are the majority, and we represent the people. But until we can fix the electoral system, also, the other issue I should mention is financing for elections. The fact that anyone can spend a ton of money of their own and you don't have to know where it comes from to elect somebody is terrible.
Right.
And that's another thing that the Supreme Court did with their Citizens United case. They allowed that to happen. So, until we can get rid of all these terrible people who are trying to keep the majority of us getting what we want, it's going to happen. The history of the world is a history of people with power making sure that the rest of us don't get it. We constantly have to fight it. Every advance we've made in civil rights has been fought. No one gave it to us.
Yeah. So, going on that score, and as far as getting things to change, I mean, you said Biden already said, I'm going to put the Voting Rights Act, arguably again, on the agenda,
Mm-hmm.
Um, what about things that they're not really constitutional, but somehow they're the law of the land? Like, correct me with the correct terminology, but it's something about the Fairness Doctrine that was
The Fairness
repealed in
Doctrine. Well, the Fairness
1987 or
Doctrine.
something. Yeah.
People don't quite understand the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine was passed. I got to back up a bit. I talk about this in
Okay.
the book as well.
Okay.
The government cannot censor the media, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But when it comes to over the air, radio and TV, there's a limited amount of frequencies. So way back when television was getting big, they said, well, we have the right to regulate the air because we want to make sure, there's only so many frequencies and we license you. So if we're going to license you to have this frequency, we get to say what you can do. And one of the things they had was the Fairness Doctrine, which said that you got to give equal time to both sides, blah, 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 blah. This never applied to cable because cable is not limited. So that's why HBO can show X-rated movies, or R-rated movies anyway.
Yeah.
And that's why Fox News can say whatever the hell they want because the First Amendment allows them to do that. It's not regulated. So honestly, if we brought the Fairness Doctrine back, it would only apply to the networks. But MSNBC and Fox would still be able to do whatever the hell they want. So really the Fairness Doctrine is not that big of a deal as people think it is.
Okay.
If you brought it back, it would only affect a few networks, and that's really not a big deal anymore. So I'm not, and I don't want a Fairness Doctrine on cable. I don't want censorship.
Yeah.
I don't want the government telling me what is right and what is wrong, which is another reason why I'm also against people who say, well, we should make Nazi symbols illegal. No, we should make nothing like that illegal. I don't want the government deciding what we can say and what we can't say, and especially not this government.
Yeah. Well, what about groups like the KKK? It's like, I mean, some people argue that, oh, that's a terrorist group, so we can get rid of them. But I mean, it is arguably free speech. I mean, so
The whole idea of
what
the
is
First
correct,
Amendment,
or is it again just what a judge says?
well, the whole idea of the First Amendment is we have to protect speech we hate. Nobody needs to protect speech we all agree with.
Yeah.
If we don't, you have to protect speech you don't like. And if you start saying, I'm going to allow your speech and not your speech, then my speech is going to be next. They're going to come after me next.
Right.
So we've got to make sure that everyone's speech is protected. That's different from action. If they do something violent, absolutely go after them, strike them down, knock them down. But what they say, you really can't censor, nor you should.
Because sometimes it seems like, at least, movies kind of represent this, because I don't really know. It's like, they get away with everything. It's like they can take over a town, which has happened in real life, not necessarily the KKK, but those type of, extreme groups like that,
They go to Charlottesville and they run around, and they say anti-Semitic things, they're bad guys. They're evil guys, obviously. But they have the right to do it as long as they don't commit any violent acts. Now, that's one of the problems with what bugs me about the current administration is these Nazis can go on march and no one says anything, and then people peacefully protest police brutality, and the cops come out and beat them up, which just is ironic in a sense.
So that's the difference. Yeah, that's the difference. Okay.
It's they're peacefully protesting. People have the right to peacefully protest, even if I hate them. So if the Nazis want to protest, let them.
Yeah.
They look like idiots. As long as they're not committing any crimes, let them do it. And the problem is we're only attacking the liberals who are protesting and not the conservatives who are protesting, apparently, at least under this administration.
Very interesting. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. I think I had a couple more questions. I'm trying to think.
The other thing I talk about in the book, and even though it's called How to Argue the Constitution with Conservatives, I do bring some liberals under task. For not understanding the First Amendment. And I was just talking about that, wanting to censor things. And you find this a lot on college campuses, especially. They want to have safe spaces. They don't want to let people talk. They want to censor students who say bad things. And to me, that's completely wrong. You need to hear all ideas. You need to not censor somebody. That's different from editing. Let me put it this way. On my Facebook page,
that's what I was going to bring up, actually.
I unfriend you, I'm not censoring you. Censorship is what the government does. I am editing you. It's
Yes.
my page. I can do whatever the hell I want. You know, if I'm
Right.
editing it,
Right.
I edit short story collections. If I decide not to use your short story, I'm not censoring you. I'm
Right.
editing you. I'm making that decision.
Right. Right. But yeah, most people don't know the distinction. But the question I had, you reminded me by saying Facebook. So
Huh?
recently, all the social media leaders like Zuckerberg and Bezos and who else all got together and testified in some sort of meeting. I didn't really watch it because I didn't want to be
Mhm.
bored to tears. So
Right.
basically, does the government, since you're talking about, the fairness law only applies to network TV, doesn't apply to cable,
Correct.
what applies, if anything, to these social media things, including TikTok and all the junk that's in the news and everything? Nothing, or
Not
can?
really. I mean, they can't. Obviously, they can't distribute child pornography. I mean, there are exceptions to the First Amendment. Obviously, child pornography is not protected. Giving out troop movements, in secret, secrets is not protected. There are a bunch of things. I'm getting off track here, but one of the issues that people seem to have is they'll read the First Amendment and say, "Oh, there's no exceptions, freedom of speech." No, there's a whole bunch of
Yeah,
exceptions, and I
yeah,
talk about them. So, but they have the right. It's their program. If
hmm,
you don't like what Facebook does, you don't have to use it.
yeah,
Go somewhere else.
yeah,
Sign off. And if they say, "Here's our rules. If you want to be in our Facebook, here's our rules," they have the right to do that, and there's not a lot you can do about it. It's not censorship. Um,
right. So arguably, Zuckerberg, using him as an example, because
mhm.
Facebook's the one I primarily use, uh, they don't really need to censor or edit for your or remove anybody's posts if they don't want to.
Right.
They're just doing it because they feel obligated to save face, as it were, correct,
Well,
to give.
partially it's publicity, but also people like me, if they didn't reduce that kind of stuff, I'd say, "I'm not going to come here anymore. I'm going somewhere else." It's a good
Yeah, that's
business
what I meant,
decision.
save face, meaning it's good
It's a good
public
business decision.
relations, to
Yeah.
keep kind of a sort of face that you're having some sort of semblance of normalcy or whatever,
I know
but
you're a big Disney fan.
yeah,
Recently, I got into an argument with somebody who was upset because Disneyland is taking the ride that's based on Song of the South,
right,
and they're
Splash
going to
Mountain,
make
yeah,
it based on a Princess and the Frog instead,
right,
which fits. It's a swamp. They can basically, the ride stays the same. They just change some of the images and
yeah,
themes of it. And someone was saying, "This is censorship. They're trying to censor, Song of the South. How terrible they are." And I'm going, "No, it's not censor. It's a business decision.
yeah,
Kids don't know Song of the South, but they know Princess and the Frog. It's a good business decision." And
yeah,
the idea that it's censorship just bugs the hell out of me. Businesses can do whatever they want.
yeah.
Come on.
Well, I mean, the fact that they don't release the film, is that considered censorship, or is that just,
No, that's their decision. They
yeah,
don't have
okay,
to.
yeah, okay,
Censorship is what the government does.
yeah,
Censorship is, anyone else is decision making. Editing is what I try to say.
yeah,
It's not the government. Now, mind you, on college campuses, if it's a public school, there's a big issue. If it's a private school, they can censor all they want.
mm,
But in a public school, you have a little more. It's a little different.
yeah,
Um, but they can decide who to invite in to give speeches or not. It's up to them. But sometimes students object. And they can protest. I think students should have the right to protest if the school invites somebody they don't like. My law school invited Scalia to come speak, who the justice of the Supreme Court, who I hated, and boy, do I rip him apart in this book. Um, and they invited him to come speak at my law school, and then they sent me, "Would you like to contribute to your alma mater?" No, that's my protest. I am not giving you a cent as long as you keep people like this coming to speak at my school. That I can do, but they have the right to invite him if they want to, and I have
right,
the right to say I'm not going.
yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question about an amendment that never passed, and
Hmm.
recently there was just enough states to say, yeah, this is okay, but there's issues behind that and stuff like that, because there is a deadline. It's the ERA, Equal
Right.
Rights Amendment.
No,
So
I
what's
worked for that
what's
back
what's
in the
the deal
70s.
on
Yeah.
that? Why was there a deadline? Why are these other states backing out? And it's like, is it can it be passed or no? What's the deal?
Well, the problem is they have the right when they passed it, when Congress passes it, to put a deadline on
Okay,
it, and they did. And then
okay,
some of the states didn't pass it in time, so it failed. And now some of the states are still trying to pass it, even though technically the original amendment had a deadline. So as
right,
far as I'm concerned, it probably is dead.
Okay.
They would have to reintroduce it and have the states repass it again,
Okay.
in my opinion.
Okay.
Now, at the same time, some states are arguing we don't need it now, and in a sense, they're right, because what happened was when the ERA was first written,
Hmm.
it was back in the days when there really was a lot of discrimination. Women couldn't hold certain property, they didn't have many rights when it came to divorces, all kind of stupid things,
Yeah.
which have now changed. The Supreme Court has come down and said, the 14th Amendment protects women. You can't discriminate against women. The
Right.
only discrimination we really have at the current time has to do with if we ever bring a draft back, only men are drafted. But that
Yeah.
might change too if a draft ever comes back. So that's kind of an irrelevant issue.
Yeah.
So in some ways, we don't need the ERA. The advantage of the ERA is symbolic, if nothing else, and it also prevents another Supreme Court from coming down saying, no, women aren't mentioned, and changing it back.
Okay.
So in a sense, it'd be nice to have it. I would like it to be passed,
Right.
but I don't necessarily think we need it right now.
Okay.
Now, let me tell you an interesting story about deadlines, because what happened was back in the early days, James Madison proposed 12 amendments, 10 of them passed. So those were our Bill of Rights.
Hmm.
One of the amendments that didn't pass was to prevent Congress from passing its own pay raise.
Yeah.
So what happens is Congress could not pass its own raise. It would have to apply to the next Congress that comes in.
Hmm.
That never passed.
Yeah.
Back in the 80s, some student noticed that, wrote an essay about it, and his teacher gave him a C. And he was pissed.
Yeah.
So he went around to all the states that hadn't passed it and got them to pass it, because the original thing did not have a deadline.
Yeah.
So that is now our 27th Amendment.
Right.
That was first passed in 1789.
Right.
So it took 200 years or so to pass that amendment.
And that's where my question came from. It's like, why did that not have a deadline? And the ERA did, but you explained, they can put a deadline on it. So,
yeah,
okay.
they have a right to in the bill.
So
yeah.
They did. So Madison forgot to, whatever,
Yes, basically.
Okay.
So I think that's a clever story. We've only had 27 amendments, and one of them was
right. And I remember when that passed, because I was in college at the time, and it just kind of came out in the news, and I said, wow, that's weird. What other ones are now? Are there other ones that are that way that haven't passed yet, but they still could, or is everything pretty much?
There's nothing too close. I have a whole proposal. I have like 7 that I think should be passed in my book that I propose, including.
Yeah, but I mean more like the 27th one that actually was proposed, and just over time they just haven't gotten enough interest or.
No, not that I can think of.
Okay.
No, there's nothing out there right now that's pending, as far as I know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
now, if there's a movement to do any sort of new amendment, I mean, how would it start? Because I mean, I don't. The last true amendment, I guess, would be the 26th of lowering the voting age to 18. Mm-hmm. I'm too young to know what that was. Why, I know why it was done, because you could fight, but you couldn't vote.
Right.
And but how does that start? Does it start on a grassroots level, or does it start with the president, or who tends to start these type of things?
I think grassroots really have a lot to do with it. People start, bringing it up in states, and some of the states pass, proposals. We hereby ask Congress to pass this amendment,
Mm-hmm.
And then Congress has to pass it first, and then it goes all to all the states, and it needs 3/4 of the states. So that's a lot. It's not that easy to get. It's not like a 50% thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, Congress would have to pass it. But yeah, I would like to see the Electoral College gotten rid of. Maybe when this new Congress comes in, if we get a Democratic Senate, that might be on the agenda. But once more, I don't think it's going to pass 3/4 of the states. That's the problem.
Yeah. And then what was my other question? Shoot, another question about amendment. Oh, yeah, the obvious one. So I always contend that a lot of right-wing people, we'll just label them. I'll label them evangelical Christians. Right-wing Republicans. Their whole deal is really just the Second Amendment and Roe versus Wade. Mm-hmm. Now, my question is really more about Roe versus Wade as to why that wasn't a constitutional amendment. Could it be a constitutional amendment, or does it matter? And if it matters, can that be overturned like as easily as everybody thinks? I know that's a lot of questions, but
Yes, a different Supreme Court could turn right around tomorrow and overturn Roe versus Wade. They could say, nope. If they do overturn Roe versus Wade, then it pretty much goes back to the states, though. So some states could make abortion legal, and some states could make it illegal. which is what we had before Roe versus Wade, and poor people who couldn't afford it went to back alleys, and they couldn't afford to travel to a state where it was legal. So yeah, a different court could change it. Now, as far as the Constitution, one of the problems with abortion is that science changes, and the viability of a child can change. And so therefore, in my opinion, the law should change as science changes. The problem with most of the anti-abortion people is they believe that, life begins at the moment the man says your place or mine, which is ridiculous, and there's no science to support that. It's all based on religion, which doesn't belong in our laws. I do have a whole chapter about religion too. Let me tell you, boy, that's part of our problem. Is part of the problem we have in America is the evangelical Christians trying to force their religious laws on us, which is why we had so much trouble getting gay rights passed and gay marriage passed, and abortion we're still fighting, and all that kind of crap. So there's not a good answer to that. I don't know if you could write a constitutional amendment saying we hereby claim that abortion will always remain legal, because then you have to define when. Because even people who support legal abortion don't think you should be able to abort the day before the baby's born, right? None of us think that. So that's the problem, is where is the line drawn? And that's the whole issue.
Because when it passed, I was 5 years old, so I didn't really, and I didn't even know what an abortion was till years later. It's like, but and I always find it amusing. It passed when there was a Republican in the White House, Nixon. Of course, he's considered very liberal compared to what we have now. But
compared to what we have now,
But I mean, did he have anything to do with it, or one way or the other, or is it just the time?
No, it's just a case that went to the Supreme Court, and basically someone was challenging the illegality of this, and the whole argument for making it illegal is based on religion. It's not based on science. And so the Supreme Court said, no, you can't make this illegal. It's a woman's right to choose. It's her body, at least up to a certain point.
Okay.
So it was a good Supreme Court decision at the time, obviously, but it wasn't unanimous. And since then, they've cracked away at it left and right, as you know. They've knocked a lot of it out.
Yeah, I mean, I have a friend of mine who said, who's a lot younger than me, and she says, "Wasn't this already decided?" And it's like, but you said earlier, these things can always be overturned no matter what. It's like, because things change, science change, like you're saying, times change.
Back in the 70s, the Supreme Court found that the death penalty was unconstitutional everywhere. No death penalty whatsoever. 10 years later, a different Supreme Court came back and said, no, it's okay.
Yeah.
So, who's on the Supreme Court makes a huge, big difference. Yeah. And this is another one of the reasons why I get so upset with people who say, well, the Constitution says this and that's it. The question is closed. It's not closed. It's interpreted by whoever is on the courts.
Right.
If everyone agreed what the law says, we wouldn't need lawyers. We wouldn't need judges, It's not.
Yeah. And people who usually do that, they always say, I'm a constitutionalist, and it's like, well, yeah, good for you. It's like, because
the problem is people who demand that their vision is, even though I am a constitutional expert in the sense, I'm not an expert. I'm not like a Harvard law professor expert who knows everything backwards and forwards.
Right.
But compared to the average person, I am, because, I got a law degree and I taught constitutional law, and this is what I do. But even I say in the book, I don't know. This is my opinion. If a different judge comes along and says something else, that's what the law says. I'm sorry. I can't say that the law says this definitely, because there's nothing definite. It's all politics. Okay. And that's the bottom line. People need to realize, when people realize that law is politics, I think they can understand it better. Too many people come and think that the law is the law and therefore that's it. No, it's all politics. It's written by politicians. It's decided by judges who are appointed by politicians or elected, and therefore they are politicians. It's all politics. And to think otherwise is naive.
Yeah. I wanted to go back on one thing you were talking about, it again, freedom of speech. And you said there are certain things you can't say, at certain situations. Is there like any place, because it's certainly not in the Constitution, that delineates what that is?
No, that's what decisions are about. The thing about the Constitution is the Constitution is an outline. It's like the foundation for a house. Here's what our goals are, and then all the laws underneath the Constitution try to meet that goal. Okay. If you know what I'm saying. So no law can go against what the Constitution says. But there are lots of exceptions. The Constitution says freedom of speech, you have the right to freedom of speech. But then, like I said, there's all kind of exceptions. One of the exceptions is called the time, place, and manner exception. You have the right to speak, but you don't have the right to go into the middle of a courtroom and give a speech, at any time you want.
Right.
You don't have the right to stand on your street at 3 a.m. with a loudspeaker and bother the neighbors. There's limits on you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, that
Right.
old one. Right.
Yeah.
So there's limits on speech. There are all kind of exceptions that are reasonable that existed even before the Constitution. Libel and slander are not protected, for instance, those kind of things.
Yeah.
Which is why I get so bugged when Second Amendment people go, the Second Amendment says this and that's it. There can be no exceptions.
Yeah.
And yet they'll agree with all the exceptions to the First Amendment. So, it's like, oh, give me. Yeah.
And it's true, you can't really libel or slander a dead person. That's correct too.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to confirm that because
Yes. So if
a lot of people say,
story,
"Oh, what will so and so's estate say if you write this?" And it's like, I don't care what they say. They can get mad.
No. I have a novel with Mark Twain and Teddy Roosevelt and Harriet Tubman, and I just use them all. I do whatever
you didn't hear from any of them. Huh?
I didn't hear anyone.
Okay.
It's now trademarks. That's different.
Yeah, but that's not a person. So, yeah.
Right. The estate can you can't sell T-shirts with the image of Marilyn Monroe on it without her estate, for instance. That's not the same thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can't slander a dead person. No.
Yeah.
And,
I'm just trying to think of
famous people there's an exception for famous people too. The more famous you are, the more you put yourself into the public domain, the more you understand that these kind of things come with the property, with your fame.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're, a famous rock star or a politician, yeah, people are going to slander you left and right, and that's just deal with it. Sorry.
Yeah. So sorry, Trump.
Yeah. Well, that's why sometimes you'll see famous people suing for slander in England where they don't have a First Amendment. Because
okay.
they can win in England when they can't win here.
Interesting. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think of different situations I've been in over the past few years on Facebook before it became this big argument clinic, it used to be.
I do my best to get rid of the crazies on my,
Yeah.
And I'll admit in the first part of the book, I say this book is for arguing with reasonable conservatives, and there still are some out there.
Yeah.
But certain Trump supporters, no matter of logic or facts, are going to change their minds. So don't even try. Just give up. But there are plenty of traditional conservatives who are reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
They're just not in power right now.
Right. Okay. That means everybody vote anyway.
Yes.
But well, I guess that's all the questions I have about that. You want to talk Monkees or something else?
Whatever you want. It's your
Actually,
show. I will mention. Let me just give a quick, push. Book is available on Amazon, anywhere else, or you can go to my webpage, michaelaventrella.com. It's fairly thin. It's fairly cheap. It's meant to be a quick and easy read and a fun read. You should laugh at it. And there's been some, if nothing else, read some of the reviews on Amazon. You'll see that's what they say. So.
Very good. Yeah. I just wanted to point out that, and I put this on Facebook earlier. So I get this magazine all the time. It's called.
Oh yeah, they put your ad in there. Great.
Yeah, and they put 2 ads actually. So there's one in the. Since I'm on TV, I can show this stuff. So it's like they had one on the inside cover, and then they put one on the back cover, and the back cover has our book right there.
Well, it's kind of hidden because your background is messing it up now, but that's okay.
Let's put it.
It's just like you have to hold it in front of your face, I think, is the way you make it work. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, you'll see it on Facebook, but so headquartered is on there. So I know we've been on Plastic EP show and stuff like that. It's like, have you gotten any feedback that you haven't seen on Amazon about our book?
Not really. Just on the Monkees pages, every once in a while, someone will make a comment about how they like the book. On some of the Facebook pages. It's also nice when you can make a comment on one of these Facebook pages for the Monkees fans, and they know who you are. It's kind of cool. So you've gotten that too, I'm sure. So that's kind of nice. But no, it's not like Nesmith and Dolan's have called me or anything. Well,
how did you know I broke my leg in 1996?
But
the
closest I've gotten was Mike laughed at a joke I posted one time on Facebook. So
that's right. You told me that was. That's cool. Trying to think if I've had any brushes like that. I mean, other than meeting all of them separately over the years, but But I mean, that's what they do. They go out and meet and greet. I would
Yeah,
think,
the problem is, I
go
wish they would agree to do interviews, but they didn't. That would have helped the book a lot if they had agreed to do that. But what can
yeah,
you do?
yeah. And, I wish Peter had written a book, but, it's like, I mean, I will say, it's like at least his career was well documented once he decided to really start a career,
Yes.
because I know you went on record as saying, it's like, well, we did as best we could with Peter because, not much there, but he really kind of dropped out. I've watched a few
Yeah.
different documentaries, and I got as much information as I could without actually talking to him at the time. But
Yeah. Well, his would be an interesting story, more so than the others, I think, because of the ups and downs he's gone. He went from huge riches to poverty to teaching, at a school to going to jail, and just trying to get his life together. That's gotta, being such a famous person for such a short time and so quickly has to affect you in some way.
yeah,
Mickey
well,
and Davey were used to it, but
yeah,
Mike
well,
and
Peter is the only one who went through all his money. Well, Michael did too, but Michael got a good influx once mom died. So it's like,
yes, exactly.
but yeah,
Exactly.
Peter
And
really spent all his Monkees money and that was it, and it's like, he had to, bounce back eventually. But, the other two, like, I didn't even put this in the book. I found out Mickey's mom actually put all his
invested his
money in a
money. Yeah.
trust. I don't think we put it in there because, they go,
Yeah.
oh, okay. So that's why
Mickey was smart.
he
Yeah.
really didn't have to do TV shows and, could do things like Keep Off My Grass and stuff because
Yep.
he didn't have to work at all if he didn't want
No,
to.
he had the
So,
money put aside. He was still getting royalties, and he was doing fine. But he liked to create and he liked to do it. I'm sure he would have rather been acting than doing some of the other stuff he was doing.
yeah.
Um, but
Yeah, but
he's got, it's come around. It's good to see that they're finally getting the recognition that they should have gotten
yeah,
now.
yeah,
And so I'm happy for them both.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I still find it fascinating that, I actually put the mask on and went to Barnes and Noble today, and they're getting magazines again.
Mm,
And there'll be a magazine devoted to, say, Led Zeppelin, and a magazine devoted to Blondie, and a
right. Right.
magazine to, of course, of the Beatles, but never a Monkees one. It's like it just seems like,
Well, we might be biased because we're fans, where the average person wouldn't care that much.
yeah,
It's I can imagine people going, why isn't there a Kinks one? I'm a big Kinks fan too, but you
yeah,
don't see books about the Kinks very often either. I mean, I've got a couple.
yeah,
you know there, there's always going to be a fan group that doesn't understand why everyone doesn't agree with them.
yeah. But
No
I
matter
always
what it
thought,
is.
the natural time, unfortunately, is when Davy and Peter passed away,
Yeah.
to cash in, but it didn't happen, especially when Davy died. I was shocked, there's a People
Well, that was
magazine.
that was pretty stubborn. That's the key too. Davies was unexpected, whereas Peters was we kind of knew it
Yeah,
was going to happen sooner or later. Yeah.
and it's like, I guess they won't get the respect of a Time magazine, even though, Time put John Lennon and George Harrison on their covers at the time. So, so I don't know.
Well, I don't want to put the Monkees in the same category as the Beatles. I'm sorry.
Right.
I'm a big fan, but when John and George died, it was a much bigger.
True, true, true. And I'm sure when Paul and Ringo go
Yes. Mm-hmm.
far off in the future, 35 years
Hopefully.
from now, it's like, it's hard to believe Ringo's 80, but
Oh
anyway,
gosh.
anyway, uh,
Pretty healthy though. I mean, he cleaned
yeah,
his act up, and he's vegetarian, no drugs, no drinking, and that's why he's living so long. I think too
yeah.
is part of it.
That's the fascinating thing on him, because I still have an article that I clipped way back when, about 1978, 79 or something, and he had some sort of stomach problem that he said almost killed him, that was related to the same stomach problem he had when he was a kid, the
Yeah.
peritonitis or something. And it's like, wow, had he died and then Lennon got shot the next year, we would have had two Beatles gone
Yeah,
then.
that would have
It's like,
been. Yeah.
and it was just kind of bizarre, and then he turns out to be the healthiest one. He's like doing jumping jacks on
Oh
stage.
yeah. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
I watched I don't know if you've had a chance to watch his 80th birthday.
Oh yeah, I watched that live. That was
Yeah,
excellent. Yeah, it
yeah.
was.
And it's like, granted, he's just sitting there talking to the audience, but still, you know,
He's
he's
80.
alert.
Yes.
He's
Yep.
alert, and and Joe Walsh came in. And he said, "How's it going?" And all that stuff. He's
Yeah,
not
Joe
like,
Walsh looked a lot worse than Ringo, that's for
yeah, I know,
sure.
and he's only like 72 or
Yeah,
something.
yeah. Yeah. No, Ringo and Paul also is, obviously a vegetarian, been for many years.
Yeah,
But I think Paul does, smoke a lot, and that can
yeah,
help him. Even though it's only marijuana, it's still not good for you to smoke that much. You
yeah.
can still get cancer from it.
Right. I think he
So
has cut back, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not in his personal life, so I really don't know.
I
I
don't
mean,
either.
the one thing going back to the Monkees with, this is that Mickey, even though he has a great singing voice, he realized as he got older, he needed to get, you know, training, whatever
Yeah.
on his voice just to keep it in shape because, you know, when you're in your 20s and 30s, you could just belt it out and scream, and you might get a sore throat, but then a week later you're fine. But
Yeah.
when you're in your 70s, it's like you got to protect that thing. It's like,
Hopefully he learned
and
from
I hope
Neil.
McCartney has learned that because he was on
Oh, his voice is
Saturday
gone.
Night Live 40th anniversary a few years, and he did Maybe I'm Amazed, and I was like, ugh, I was
No, quite a
cringing.
few times. Quite a
Yeah,
few times I've heard Paul singing and going, Paul, you got to stop. You got to cut that song out of your repertoire.
yeah,
It's
or
just
sing it in a lower key or something.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
like
I
because
agree.
other
Whereas
other artists do that.
Mickey still sings. I mean, I heard him in concert just a few years ago, and he sounds as good as he ever did. He's hitting all those high notes. I'm amazed
Yeah.
with Mickey. He's got a great
Yeah, but
voice.
he didn't do it naturally. He did get help, which
Right.
is fine. I'm glad he admitted
Exactly.
that because, I think the big
And it
thing
might have been
is,
from Nielsen, who's a good friend of Mickey's, because Nielsen, as you know, really threw his voice out. He smoked too
right.
much. You listen to his last albums, and the voice is gone. There
Yeah,
really is.
yeah,
And it's very sad to listen to some of those albums and hear
yeah.
that voice
Well,
gone.
especially if you listen to A Touch of Schmielsen in the Night and then
Right. And then you listen.
Pussycats. Arr!
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Or do it on Monday,
Yeah,
and just you listen to those raspy voice, and it's like, oh, where did Nielsen go?
yeah,
Because he didn't take care of it. So,
yeah,
oh well.
yeah. But so I have heard Paul sing somewhere else more recently, so maybe he has gotten a coach to help him out because he sounded a little bit better than
Well,
he
on the
had for.
albums, you can tell on the albums. He's still,
Yeah,
if you listen to his most recent albums, you can hear the voice isn't quite there. But
right.
at the same time, there's no straining that you hear live. So either his producer changed the key, or
Yeah,
they edited out all the bad ones.
yeah,
But on the record, he sounds okay.
yeah. But it was a live performance that I heard pretty recently that he had done right before this, or it might have been during the pandemic. I think it was during, and he
Mhm.
sounded better, and I mean thinking, well, maybe it's because he's also not touring every day of the year. It's like he's had a chance to let it
Well,
rest
that's
or
true.
something.
If
Yeah,
you have to sing, the other thing about pouring, as someone who's performed live,
yeah,
you end up singing a lot louder just to hear yourself. You don't
mm,
realize it too. You'll be at the microphone and it's really loud. And instead of just, even if it's a quiet song, when you're recording, you can be nice and quiet, because the microphone's picking everything up. But when you're live, you scream it out. And that's got
right.
to be bad for your throat.
Yes,
I was never the main singer. I was only backup, so I didn't have that problem. But,
right.
I could certainly see how that would affect somebody.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I've always wondered, like, you put on, I'll put on a CD or a record, or I'll stream some music. Let's be current, But after about 5 or 6 songs, I'm like, I'm done, singing along with the
Oh,
music,
okay. Yeah.
yeah, and it's like I think about these guys, and they'll sing like 15, 20, 25 songs sometimes, and they're, you know, how do they do it? It's like,
Not yet.
yeah,
You got to treat your voice like it's an instrument if you're the singer. You
yeah,
gotta drink the tea and not smoke and
yeah.
take care of yourself. Obviously, it's
Yeah, and I know people
nowadays.
like Elton John. He had like nodules on the throat and stuff, and he had to get an operation, which saved him for a good 20 more years or something like that. Otherwise, he probably would have retired long
Mhm.
ago. But anyway,
Yeah, no, got to take care of yourself.
yeah.
All right,
All right. Well, this has been fun.
nice seeing you
uh,
again. Yeah.
good seeing you. Give another plug for the Constitution book and where you can get it and how they can reach you.
Sure. All of my books you can get at michaelaventrella.com. And if you go to michaelaventrella.com, there's also links to the Monkees books that we wrote together. And there's links and reviews, and you can read the first chapter. Also, if you go to my webpage, I will actually read the first chapter to you. I recorded a Zoom conference of me reading the first chapter, so you can listen to it for free. So everything's available there. Just go to michaelaventrella.com. And if worse comes to worse, and if you can't remember that, go to Amazon and just look up How to Argue the Constitution with a Conservative. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or ebook.
Sounds good.
Mhm.
All right. Well, thank you for being my guest today. And I will talk to you soon.
Thank you, Mark. Nice seeing you again.
Good seeing you. Bye.
Bye-bye.